the impact of the United Nations on America's armed forces.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Harold Shurtleff. I'm the New England coordinator for the John Birch Society. I want to welcome you to the Hyde Park chapter bi-monthly public forum, and thank you for coming out in this very lousy weather-wise evening. Before we begin our program, we're going to have a prayer and a pledge of allegiance. I'm going to introduce Pastor Catherine Walker Searcy of the First Pentecostal Missionary Church for God to open in prayer. She is a good friend of mine, a local member of the Birch Society, and then we're going to please remain standing for a pledge of allegiance. Pastor Searcy, could you please come up? Please stand.
Father, this night we come to thank you for allowing us to come into such an opportunity as this. God, we ask your blessings upon each and every one across this whole country, oh God. We thank you so much for the John Birch Society. We pray, oh God, that with their knowledge and their wisdom and their understanding of government and what's going on, that you will speak to the people. We thank you so much, and we just praise you for who you are and for what you're doing in this society. In the name of Jesus, amen.
Amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which stands one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I want to recommend that everybody here put their name on our mailing list. We have programs every other month, public forums. And for those of you who may be watching this program around the country, at the end of the program, there'll be an address and a phone number, hopefully, and you can contact us, or you can call my Boston or Hyde Park office if you live in the New England area. I want to mention a few items we have available. Mr. McManus will be discussing putting out a lot of information. And keep in mind, everything we talk about, we can very well document. And one of the most revealing documents is a little item that Mr. McManus will talk about. It's called Freedom from War, State Department Document 7277. In a special issue of the New American, we call it the New World Army issue, we have the document stitched in, and please pick a copy of this up. Also, to complement this particular issue is a copy of what we call the Police State issue of the New American, and this also contains 7277 and a lot of interesting information about the gun control issue. So please, we urge you to take this information. Without the information, you're not going to be able to inform others properly. At this time, I want to introduce our chapter leader for the Hyde Park chapter, Attorney Paul Gallifin, and he will in turn introduce our speaker this evening. Paul?
Thank you, Pastor Searcy. Thank you, Hal Shurtleff. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Now in his 37th year, educating Americans on the truly remarkable heritage of America and of the miraculous instruments our framers have given to us, the John Birch Society presses forward with an educational mission stronger than ever, supplying men and women with information and understanding of the problems saddled onto our country by a federal government taken far from its constitutional moorings. What the framers gave us was truly miraculous. For those who quickly and easily deprecate the Constitution, a warning and a reminder should be given. Freedom's equation is linear. The bigger government is, the less the freedom from government the people enjoy. Conversely, when the people truly enjoy freedom, their freedom is evidenced by that hallmark of liberty, a small and limited government. And limiting government was the sole and singular purpose of our Constitution. There was no other. Every public official, from the highest to the lowest, every public official takes an oath pledging to this principle that he or she will, by word of honor, support and defend, quote, this Constitution, unquote. That is, the written one. The one whose singular purpose was to create in one brushstroke on the canvas a central government sufficient to defend and support national interest, but at the same time to limit that government with the second and final stroke. If our elected officials voluntarily subscribe to the constitutional oath, but ignore the very institutional constructs of limitation which form the Constitution and which are the very heart and soul of the mechanisms designed to frustrate the accumulation and concentration of power, are they working to secure the blessings of liberty? Are they deserving of our trust? What does such disobedience say in terms of any oath which such people may take, from the marital oath to any other contractual obligations of life? And if these elected officials are unable to remain faithful to their oath, or worse, will not remain faithful to their oath, then let them step aside. And if they will not go voluntarily, then let an electorate, informed and knowledgeable on the people's Constitution, do it for them by ballot. Informing and educating the electorate on the limited role intentionally crafted by our framers is the business of the John Birch Society. For the last 4 years, the Society has been skillfully and ably led by tonight's speaker, John McManus, who, like the Society, brings an untiring dedication to the task at hand, namely, to inform and educate fellow Americans of whatever ethnic background, of whatever skin color, of whatever religious belief, of whatever political strife, of the chief purpose of our Constitution, to limit the created government. Joining the Society as a member some 30 years ago, Ms. McManus moved to greater and greater levels of responsibility in the Society, from chapter leader to coordinator to major coordinator to director of public relations and finally to the presidency of the Society. Along the way, he has written numerous articles for American Opinion and the New American Opinion magazine and the New American, both national publications of the Birch Society, as well as several books, the most recent of which are Financial Terrorism, the treasonous story of how our country has been taken from being the largest creditor nation in the world to being the largest debtor nation in the world. And also Changing Commands, the topic of tonight's discussion. Not only is Changing the Commands the discussion of tonight's discussion, it will also be the focus of a month-long book promotional tour east of the Mississippi, which Mr. McManus will begin in late March of 1995. Jack and countless other members of the Birch Society have labored long to restore our republic to greatness. And yes, it was a republic that the founders gave us, a form of government which demanded that the foremost postulate to guide the people's created servant, known as government, be one of strict adherence to a written standard. This is the definition of a republic, a government formed and maintained by written laws, not the whims of men. Despite the mantra-like chantings of Brokaw, Jennings, Rather, and Chung, enforcing the purposeful limitations of the federal government's sphere of relevance to those, quote, few and specific, unquote, areas set forth in the Constitution, to borrow from James Madison. And let us be about the business of letting friends, neighbors, business associates, and colleagues know this too. For what purpose? So that the people, all of the people, will enjoy the greatest amount of freedom from government. Early on in his life, Mr. McManus recognized the honorable and worthy goals of the John Birch Society. These same honorable and worthy goals are also deserving of the attention and thoughtful investigation of every American who is puzzled at the direction our country has been taken. Never has the John Birch Society been the racist, anti-Semitic, anti-Catholic, fascist, Nazi-like extremist organization which those who champion big and bigger government have falsely accused the society. The John Birch Society proudly welcomes into its ranks any and every American who is motivated by morality, a love for freedom, and who is willing to work for that ideal which is encapsulated in the Birch Society's motto: less government, more personal responsibility, and with God's help, a better world. The United Nations, the New World Army, Changing Commands. Ladies and gentlemen, won't you please join with me in welcoming the President of the John Birch Society, Mr. John McManus.
Thank you, Paul, Hal, Pastor Cersei, ladies and gentlemen. Delight to be here on a very mean night out there, I guess we could say. Our subject tonight is going to be the United Nations and the United States military. As Paul Galvin has told you, there is a new book that I've written called Changing Commands, the subtitle, The Betrayal of America's Military. And what I have here is what you might call a prototype. The book itself is not available yet. It went to press early in March, will be available in late March of 1995. So we've kind of dummied one up there. Now, we always like to start off these programs with something to, I guess you could say, warm up the audience. And I want to tell you the story about the duck hunter. A fellow went out duck hunting, and he brought along one of his friends who had never been out duck hunting before. And they had a brand new dog, so they went out duck hunting. They brought the new dog, and all of a sudden, the ducks were flying over, and they got the shotguns out, and blam, and the duck came floating down into the pond. And the dog walked out on the water and grabbed the duck and walked back. Well, the friend was kind of startled. All of a sudden, more ducks came over, the same thing. They shot the duck came down, the dog walked out on the water, grabbed the duck, and walked back. And finally, the man said to his friend, he said, "Hey," he said, "did you notice anything different about my dog?" And the fellow said, "Yeah, he can't swim." I guess you could say he missed the point. And I think that's the case in America today. There are an awful lot of our fellow citizens who miss the point. So let's make a few points and see if we can't get some more people to understand some of the things that we think are important and that they should understand. Let's begin by defining our nation. Certainly Paul has done it. I like to do it as well. We go back to the foundation of the United States of America. We go right back to the beginning, and that, of course, is the Declaration of Independence. When our founding fathers had enough of oppression by the British, they broke away and they formed our nation with the Declaration of Independence. And there you'll find the philosophical base upon which the nation is built. Especially this little part here which says men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Now stop right there and realize that that doesn't happen in history. In fact, I don't know that it ever happened at the beginning of any nation before. They said there was a God and that our rights came from God, not from government. And then they went on in the very next breath to define what government is supposed to be. They said to secure these rights, governments are instituted. And so here you had, for one of the only times in the history of mankind, everything in its proper order. God was on top, individuals next with their rights that came from God, and then they formed governments for the purpose of securing their rights. Not to redistribute the wealth, not to take control of the people, not to dominate their lives and so forth, simply to safeguard their rights. That's Americanism. That's the philosophical base upon which our nation was built. Well, of course, the British didn't care for that. They decided that they wanted to hold on to the colonies, as they called this nation. And so there was a war, the War for Independence. We won the war. We sent the British back across the ocean. We had fought the war under the Articles of Confederation, and even before that, the Continental Congress. And then in 1787, the founders got together in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation, but they came out with a whole new governmental system, a marvelous governmental system called the Constitution of the United States of America. And it's so marvelous, you can see how few pages it is. And that would mean that it could never have been written by government today. You can be certain of that. Whom does that limit? Does that limit you and me? No, it limits government, doesn't it? Strictly defined powers are given, checks and balances, division of powers, separation of powers, everything they could possibly think of to have government properly empowered, and then no more. And then they didn't even ram it down the throats of the people. They sent it back to the states for ratification, and one after another the states did ratify the Constitution, and our nation's system of government began in 1789. Now, there were some men amongst the founders who were a little bit upset about the fact that it never did list any of these God-given rights. And so there was a pact made. And the pact was, we'll get the Constitution ratified, and then we'll add to it a statement of what we believe our rights to be. And so they did. Those were amazing days, I like to say. The politicians kept their promise. And the Bill of Rights was added. Now, there's the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which should be considered part of the original Constitution. Now, what do they say? Well, you know what they say, and so do most Americans. They know it's about freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom of the press and so forth. But most people talk about it as if government gave us those freedoms, and government didn't. And you know that from reading the wording of the Bill of Rights, where it says, Congress shall make no law respecting this right and this right and this right and this one. Congress shall make no law because the right transcends any power of government which is down here. And so government shall have nothing to say about the establishment of religion or abridging freedom of speech and freedom of the press and so forth. And they are not First Amendment rights, or they are not Second Amendment rights. They are God-given rights protected by the First Amendment, protected by the Second Amendment. And there's nothing more clear. Congress shall make no law. We live at a time, of course, when judges and Congress and everybody else, they are making laws regarding these rights, even while they swear an oath to the Constitution of the United States. The American people have let down their guard, and we are suffering under increasing amounts of government at all times. But anyhow, I wanted to establish what we believe in the John Birch Society. We believe very strongly in what the founders gave us. Now, I said we're going to talk about the United Nations, so let me contrast. We'll contrast the United Nations with the United States. And we start off very simply by saying that at the United Nations there is no God. There is no mention of God. There never has been any mention of God. And therefore, the United Nations' attitude regarding rights is not that they come from God. They never really do say where they come from. They want you to presume that the United Nations or some government gave them to you. In 1966, the United Nations published the International Covenants on Human Rights. I've been carrying this booklet around with me for many years. You can see it's getting a little bit soiled. Now, one of the covenants in this United Nations document is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. There are actually 3 in the booklet. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights has been labeled the equivalent of the Bill of Rights of the United States Constitution because it talks about the same kinds of rights. However, it doesn't start off with the premise that the rights come from God. So let's see how the United Nations treats these rights. I will read to you from Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of the United Nations. It says, everyone shall have the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Well, that sounds good, doesn't it? Where did it come from? They didn't say. And 2 paragraphs later, they say this: freedom to manifest one's religion or beliefs may be subject only to such limitations as are prescribed by law. In other words, they retain power to cancel the right that they've even talked about. If a right can be prescribed by law, I assure you it will be. And over again, the United Nations says the same thing. The next, Article 19, everyone shall have the right to freedom of expression. And then it says, the exercise of the right provided for in paragraph 2 of this article carries special duties and responsibilities. It may therefore be subject to certain restrictions, but these shall only be such as are provided by law. Article 21, the right of peaceful assembly shall be recognized. No restrictions shall be placed on the exercise of this right other than those imposed in conformity with the law. On and on we go. Here's your right, but we retain the power to construct a law to drive that right out of existence. That is exactly parallel to the Constitution of the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin. And you know how many rights the people enjoyed there. The United States and the United Nations are totally incompatible. If you get back to the fundamentals of our country, you see that the fundamentals of the United Nations are totally different. We don't want that. We in the John Birch Society would like more Americans to appreciate the great heritage we were given by brave and far-seeing individuals over 200 years ago who constructed this nation and built it on a very sound foundation. Now let's move ahead here. We want to talk about a lot of events in the 20th century, and I like to characterize the 20th century and most of its major events as a progression towards total world government. I think most of the major events of the 20th century occurred because there were people behind the scenes making them happen in order to bring about more government, and world government. Now let me start by repeating something here I frequently heard from the lips of Robert Welch, the founder of the John Birch Society, Lord rest his soul. He said many times, war always means more government. And that's so. What he was saying is that war, in other words, can be a useful tool in the hands of scoundrels. Robert Welch wasn't the first to arrive at such a conclusion. Plato, in ancient Greece, he accused would-be tyrants of, quote, always stirring up some war or other in order that the people may require a leader, close quote. William Shakespeare had King Henry IV advise his son, Prince Hal, be it thy course to busy giddy minds with foreign quarrels. Keep the people's minds on some war while you acquire more power over them. 200 years ago, a British poet named William Cooper stated, but war's a game which, were their subjects wise, kings would not play at. If the people were aware, in other words, the kings wouldn't play at war with their lives and their treasure. Before Robert Welch, however, hardly anyone would use the word that all of these thinkers were hinting at, and that word is conspiracy. Kings and rulers have forever been engaged in conspiracies to feather their own nests, or, as Abraham Lincoln once said, they were always involving and impoverishing their people in wars for deceitful purposes. One man who did have the guts to use the word conspiracy to describe exactly what I'm driving at was Alexander Hamilton. I'll get to what he said in a moment. But first, let's remember that our nation's affairs are supposed to be guided by this Constitution. It grants power to Congress to raise and support armies. But it forbids Congress to fund such a force for any term longer than 2 years. And then in a separate article, a separate clause, it grants power to Congress to provide and maintain a navy. Now there's a big difference here. Congress may raise an army and can't fund it for more than 2 years at a time, but Congress must provide for a navy. Why the difference? We may have an army, we must have a navy. The difference is easy to explain. The Founding Fathers knew that a standing army could do exactly what Plato, Shakespeare, Cooper, Robert Welch, and many other great thinkers throughout history had learned. They learned that if an unscrupulous ruler has a military force at his disposal, he will likely use it not to promote the nation's interests, but to promote his own. Unscrupulous ruler. That might be the redundancy of the month. Our nation's founders greatly feared the creation of a standing army, which is why they stipulated no funding for one for more than 2 years at a time. Let's recall that one of the complaints against King George in the Declaration of Independence, which of course, if you've read, you know, is a series of complaints against the king, which is why we're declaring ourselves independent. One of the complaints aimed at King George was, he has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislature. In other words, they'd had their fill of standing armies. And yet James Madison stated that the Navy will be a principal source of her security against danger from abroad, and that it would not be the kind of force that a leader could turn against his own people's liberties. An army could be turned against the people, they believed, because it was within, but a navy could not because it was along the shore. So they feared a standing army, but they still went ahead and appropriated funds for one because they knew that other nations might move against the infant United States. Hamilton said that prohibiting an army would have the United States, quote, exhibit the most extraordinary spectacle, that of a nation incapacitated by its own constitution to prepare for defense before it was actually invaded, close quote. I'll get back to Hamilton. It was while he was arguing in favor of a limited standing army that he talked about a conspiracy that might arise to use an army to subvert the liberties of this nation's people. Here is what he said in the Federalist Papers. And of course, I recommend these. I recommend reading the essays that the Founding Fathers wrote to explain the Constitution. Madison, Madison, Hamilton, and Jay wrote essentially letters to the editor of a New York newspaper to explain the Constitution to the farmers in New York State. And if you read these, you'll appreciate the level of education in that period, because I've known college graduates who cannot read the Federalist Papers today. But those farmers most of them never even went to school. But anyhow, what did Hamilton say? In Federalist number 26, he said this: "An army so large as seriously to menace those liberties could only be formed by progressive augmentations, which would suppose not merely a temporary combination between the legislature and the executive, but a continued conspiracy for a series of time." In other words, he said it would have to have been plotted out in order to get the standing army to go against the people's wishes. You can see from that passage that he worried about a potential conspiracy involving the president and the Congress to use the military for evil purposes. But he went on in this very same essay, and he said this: "Can it be supposed that there would not be found one man in the Congress discerning enough to detect so atrocious a conspiracy, or bold and honest enough to apprise his constituents of their danger?" Well, after raising the possibility of a conspiracy to use the military wrongly, Hamilton said that such a conspiracy was impossible. He and others among the founders expected that the Constitution would always be understood and respected by the members of the Congress, and especially by the people. He could not imagine that powerful forces working in the shadows could arrange to have national leaders betray their oath and misuse the military. And even more, in his wildest nightmare, he never expected that national leaders would not only use the military wrongly, but also sell out their country in the process. Hamilton made another point, too. Another point that he made was that the assignment of the president as the commander-in-chief was an occasional assignment of responsibility, not a grant of power. We live at a time when the president thinks that the military is his and he can do whatever he wants with it. But that's not what was intended. And of course, if you're going to look at a constitution, if you're going to understand what the Founding Fathers meant, if you're going to understand what these people put their hand on a Bible and swear an oath to, you have to go back to the founders. That's the principle of any law. You go back to the intent of the lawgiver. And if you go back to the intent of the lawgiver today and you read the Constitution of the United States, you realize how far we have departed from what was intended. In fact, if the government of the United States were under the Constitution as written, it would be 20% its size and 20% its cost. Wouldn't that be nice? Well, let's move on here. This brings us to right up to the present. We'll be bouncing around a little bit in history here, but let's come right up to the present time. In December of 1990, there were two senators, Senator Paul Simon, excuse me, I'm going to have a sip of this. Senator Paul Simon of Illinois and Senator George Mitchell of Maine had just gone off to Saudi Arabia and visited 500,000 American military people making preparations for war. This was December of 1990. The war against Iraq started on January 17th, 1991. So this was only a couple of weeks before the war. They came back from it. They went and visited with Mr. Bush in the White House. They pleaded with him to negotiate further with Saddam Hussein, or to give economic sanctions more time to work, or to do whatever else he could to avoid the bloodshed that they had every reason to expect in the weeks ahead. I'm sure you recall, as I certainly do myself, the predictions of many, many casualties coming out of there when Saddam Hussein's crack army was going to be a problem for us. But George Bush said to the two senators the following: "Let me give you this final message. If we use the military, we can make the United Nations a really meaningful, effective voice for peace and stability in the future. Consider that. If we use the military, we can build the United Nations. That was his goal. It had very little to do with Saddam Hussein and Kuwait. His goal, as he said over and over again, was to reinvigorate the United Nations, to build the United Nations, and so forth. He eventually gave the order, and the war began. He wasn't retaliating for aggression against our nation. There wasn't any. He wasn't about to send our troops into battle to protect American lives and property. None had been attacked, and none were threatened. It wasn't his intention to order American forces into the Iraq-Kuwait confrontation in order to defend an ally to whom we were treaty bound, because we had no such treaty with Kuwait. Our nation's forces should never have been involved in this fight between Arab neighbors. But why did he do it? He told those two senators, and Senator Paul Simon put those remarks in the congressional record. George Bush said he would use the military to make the United Nations look good. And he did. And soon afterwards, the next issue of Foreign Affairs magazine, which is the journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, the premier world government promoters in our day, to which Mr. Bush owes allegiance for his many years of membership, they came out with their next issue, and they did something quite unusual. They had a 4-page unsigned editorial at the beginning of the magazine. It's the first time I've ever seen that. And here's what it said. It said, "Never before in American history was there a period quite like it. For 48 days, the United States moved inexorably toward war, acting on authority granted by an international organization. On November 29, 1990, in an unprecedented step," the editorial continues, "the United Nations Security Council authorized the use after January 15, 1991, of all necessary means to achieve the withdrawal of Iraqi forces from the territory of Kuwait. On January 12th, the Congress of the United States authorized President Bush to use American armed forces to implement that resolution." That, too, was unprecedented, they said. And indeed it was. George Bush started a war. He even called it a war. He didn't call it a police action like Harry Truman did back in 1950. He called it a war. But what does the Constitution say about war? The Constitution is very clear. Congress has the power to declare war, not the president. And Congress let him get away with it. He did it in order to build the United Nations. How do we know that? He told us so, didn't he? If we use the military, we can build the United Nations. That's what he said. Well, what then happened? After the war in Iraq was over, Mr. Bush went basking in glory to the United Nations headquarters in September of 1991. And excuse me, let me get back to something in the interim. In June of 1990, oh, my notes are mixed up here. Let me see here. In September of 1991, I was correct. President Bush went to the United Nations and he delivered a speech. It was called his Pax Universalis speech, universal peace. And in that speech, he placed the United States on record favoring United Nations military action to settle nationalist passions within the borders of any nation. He even sanctioned the use of UN power to remove a nation's leader. Now, the United Nations has a charter. Its charter, of course, does not mention God, as we've already noted. But Article 2, Section 7 of the Charter of the United Nations is quite clear about something. It says, "Nothing contained in the present charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state." In other words, the United Nations, for whatever it is only supposed to have some sort of attitude about conflicts between neighboring nations or other nations, not within a nation. Now, what's interesting about that is that a former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, a man named James Wadsworth, he wrote a book in 1966 called The Glass House, The United Nations in Action. And in that book, he said, it is a foregone conclusion that had this provision that I just read to you from the UN Charter, had that been omitted from the Charter, literally dozens of prospective members in 1945 would have balked at ratification of the treaty. Certainly the United States would have been among them. In other words, most of the nations of the world were saying, okay, if you're going to form this United Nations, don't have any jurisdiction over problems within our borders. But President Bush went to the United Nations in September of 1991 and put the United States on record in favor of the United Nations expanding its scope dramatically. Well, a few months after that, we're up now to June of 1992, and the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Boutros Ghali from Egypt, I'm looking for something here, he came out with a pamphlet, a proposal called An Agenda for Peace. This was June of 1992. And in keeping with the United Nations' overall intention to rule the nations of the world, it begins by noting, and I quote, "The time of absolute and exclusive sovereignty has passed." In other words, national independence, national sovereignty, no more. It then called for United Nations military intervention anywhere in the world to address an entirely new listing of domestic matters within the borders of any nation. According to the Ghali plan, the United Nations would now confront ecological damage, disruption of family life, unchecked population growth, drug usage, poverty, disease, famine, disparity between rich and poor, virtually anything. And George Bush had already said that he was in support of this. Speaking at the United Nations on September 22nd, 1992, Mr. Bush went back to the United Nations. He said, "I welcome the Secretary General's call for a new agenda to strengthen the United Nations' ability to prevent, contain, and resolve conflict across the globe." And he especially mentioned that it was time for the United Nations to be involved in humanitarian relief. Well, you see what we're leading to. You can see the progression here of the United Nations becoming much more of a force in the world, and the United States right behind it, and in fact, the United States troops being used to build the United Nations. We go to December of 1992, 1 month after George Bush had been soundly defeated for re-election. He sent 30,000 United States troops to Somalia in what he claimed was a humanitarian mission. Now keep in mind that whatever was going on in Somalia, it was all within the borders of the nation. And Article 2, Section 7 of the United Nations Charter forbids the United Nations to have anything to say about it. Never mind, we're just discarding that like we're discarding the Constitution and everything else along the way. So George Bush cited a United Nations resolution for authority to go into Somalia, one that he had actually asked the United Nations Security Council to supply. And again, he had no constitutional authority, he had no congressional authorization, and there was very little said by anybody in Congress. Well, pretty soon they were shooting. The humanitarian mission was changed into a little bit of a scrape here and there, and pretty soon 18 Americans died after being ambushed in October of 1993. And when U.S. television showed the body of an American GI being dragged through the Somali streets, some of the bloom faded from the UN rose. What did Mr. Clinton do? He's now in office. He pulled out some of our forces, but then he put 4,000 American combat troops under the command of a Turkish general named Servik Bir, the first time in our nation's history that U.S. combat forces were forced to serve under anyone but an American. Another step into the United Nations web. In September 1994, President Clinton sent tens of thousands of our nation's troops to Haiti to enforce another UN resolution. 11 months before that deployment, Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina sought to amend the Defense Appropriation Act to bar any allocation of funds for military action in Haiti unless Congress approved such action after it received written certification from the President that it was necessary to protect and evacuate American citizens. The Helms Amendment was defeated in the Senate 83-19. Now, excuse me, that can't be. That's 102. 81-19 it was. So here we have another step. You see, precedents being made all along the way. There were some people who went to President Clinton and said, "Where are you getting the authority to send troops into Haiti?" Listen to what he said. "I would welcome the support of Congress, and I hope that I might have it, but like my predecessors of both parties, I have not agreed that I was constitutionally mandated to get it." Well, what does the Constitution say? The Constitution says Congress shall declare war. The founding fathers tell us that the President is the commander-in-chief, but that is an assignment of responsibility. It is not a grant of power. And then, acting on another precedent established during the operation in Somalia, Mr. Clinton directed the United States forces to replace Haiti's leader and to disarm the civilian population. Now, in an age when precedents are swiftly relied upon to justify additional action, the United Nations' newly adopted role of choosing national leaders and disarming civilians constitutes a threat to the independence of any nation, certainly including ours. Might we ever get to a point where United Nations troops are sent to America while our own military are stationed in Germany and in the Middle East and in Japan and in Korea and every place else in order to disarm the American people and to replace our leaders? Well, the precedent is there. I hope to God it never happens. In September 1994, New Jersey's McGuire Air Force Base was named headquarters of a new Air Force East Coast Air Mobility Wing. They are equipped with Starlifter cargo jets and extender refuelers, and the base will be responsible for projecting U.S. military power throughout Europe and the East. Travis Air Force Base in California, similar responsibilities, had earlier been designated as headquarters for the West Coast Air Mobility Wing, and the two bases will help to fulfill whatever UN-related missions a president assigns to our forces. Now, as Air Force Chief of Staff nominee, he was just a nominee at the time, he's now the Chief of Staff, Air Force General Ronald Fogelman, who happens to be a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, he visited the McGuire base at that particular time when it was being named the headquarters of this new air wing. And referring to his Air Force Command insignia, he stated, "I wake up some mornings and I look at this patch and I wonder whether it is the United States Command or the United Nations Command." And of course, it didn't bother him at all. He's perfectly willing to go along with all of that. He's been a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's imbued with their attitudes about world government and about the wonders of the United Nations and so forth. Well, ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, we are giving away our military. We are allowing the president to do what he wants with it, and they never do anything without the United Nations involvement. We started this with President Bush building the United Nations and using the military to do so. But in order to understand how we're in the situation we're in, we've got to go way back to the beginning. So let's back up and go all the way back to the time when the United Nations Treaty was being debated in the United States Senate in July of 1945. July of 1945, of course, the war, World War II, was still raging in Asia. It was over in Europe. It didn't end in Asia for another 3 or 4 weeks. And the treaty was presented to the Senate. There was great fanfare about it. There was all kinds of propaganda all during World War II about the need for a world government organization to do away with war. The attitude being that if everybody gives up their military and puts it in the hands of the United Nations, then there will be no war. But very few people stopped and said, well, yeah, but what will those who run the United Nations do with that power? Putting all of that power in any repository is asking for it to be used to impose tyranny. Now, back in 1919, the U.S. Senate had been asked to ratify America's entry into the League of Nations. The senators debated the matter for 8 or 9 months and said no. And we did not get involved in the League of Nations. That was to be the main effect of World War I. But when the United States didn't get involved, that meant that the League of Nations would never really amount to much. And so when another war came along, and a case can be made for the Second World War being brought along in order to set the stage for world government, then the senators were presented with the United Nations Treaty, which had been carried from San Francisco to Washington by the Secretary General of the founding conference, who was a man named Alger Hiss, a State Department employee who was later shown, beyond the shadow of a doubt, to have been a communist agent, a disloyal American. During the debate in the Senate, a senator named Burton Wheeler from Montana said this: "If we enter into this treaty, we take power away from the Congress, and the president can send troops all over the world to fight battles everywhere. If you say that's the policy of this country, I say the American people will never support any senator or representative who advocates this policy, and do not make any mistake about it. If we enter into this treaty, we take power away from the Congress, and the president can send troops all over the world to fight battles everywhere." He said that in July 24th, 1945, and 2 days later, when the vote came up for the ratification of the treaty, even he voted for it. And the vote in the Senate was 89-2. There were 2 senators who said no. One of the 2 was Senator Henrik Shipstad of Minnesota. And he said, "It is held by some members of Congress that the United States delegate to the United Nations Executive Council," that would be our ambassador to the United Nations, "in ordering out troops will act independently of the Congress and without its authority, but will be solely under the orders of the President. This view is held by some on the ground that the President is a symbol of sovereignty, and so has the right to call the army into war in foreign countries without consulting Congress." And this is why he was going to vote against it. He saw what was coming in 1945. He said the control of the war power as provided in the Constitution must remain in the Congress if the United States is going to remain a republic. So he and Senator Langer from North Dakota were the only 2 votes against. The treaty was ratified. Now, Senator Wheeler, who made such a profoundly sound statement, figured that later on down the road he'd get a chance to vote against a carte blanche permission of the president to do what he wanted with the military. And that came up in December of 1945, 5 months down the road, with a vote on what was called the United Nations Participation Act. Right from the start of the debate about this act, it became obvious that no interference with the plan to arm the president with power to commit troops to UN duty would be tolerated. There was Senator Wheeler, I mentioned him, from Montana, and Senator Raymond Willis of Indiana offered an amendment to this UN Participation Act. Their amendment specifically challenged the unconstitutional grab for power by the executive branch. Their proposal sought to require the president to obtain congressional authorization each time he wanted to make the United States Armed Forces available to the UN Security Council. The vote was defeated 65-9. And you can see the casting aside of the Constitution. We're talking 1945. The problems that we're faced with today are not problems that just arrived. The seeds were planted, and the horror of war was so great that these people were saying anything to prevent more war in the future. So the United Nations Participation Act was passed. We move ahead now to 1949 and the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. NATO, of course, was a military alliance. But John Foster Dulles, who was now a senator in New York, would later become the Secretary of State under Eisenhower and was a founder of the Council on Foreign Relations. He told the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that NATO should be operated not as a military instrument, but as a step in a political evolution. You see, if the United Nations were abolished tomorrow, the problem that I'm describing would still be there because of NATO. And NATO is a subsidiary of the United Nations. It's a regional arrangement under Articles, 60 and 70 or something here in the United Nations Charter. Well, Senator Robert Taft now had voted for the United Nations in 1945 and then had later said the United Nations is a trap, let's go it alone. He wanted out by now. Now he was wary. He was wary about this NATO thing. So he argued against it. He warned that NATO obligates us to go to war if at any time during the next 20 years anyone makes an armed attack on any one of the 12 nations in NATO, insisting that sending our men into war is legitimate only to protect the liberty of the people. He took the occasion afforded during the debate about NATO to criticize the Truman administration. Now, that's a very important point. The purpose of our military is to protect the lives and the property of the people of this country. That's it. We have a new category now of reason for our military. It's to defend the vital interests of the United States. Is that defined anywhere? No. It could be anything. That's exactly what Mr. Clinton said when he sent troops into Haiti. And it was ludicrous. The vital interests of the United States in Haiti, there were none. But what was the real purpose? The real purpose was to increase the clout of the United Nations. So here's what Robert Taft, senator from Ohio, said about the Truman administration in 1949 during the NATO debate. He said it had adopted a tendency to interfere in the affairs of other nations, to assume that we are a kind of demigod and Santa Claus to solve the problems of the world, and that attitude is more and more likely to involve us in disputes where our liberty is not in fact concerned. See, there were people who saw this coming. They were people who opposed all of these steps that have gotten us into this situation that we're in today. Well, NATO was created. Troops were sent to Europe to be a part of the defense of Western Europe. This is a form of foreign aid. It costs us hundreds of billions of dollars to defend the nations of Western Europe. We also defend Korea. We defend Japan. We have them in the Middle East. We have them in Somalia. We have them in Macedonia. I read recently where they had just come back from Colombia. I didn't even know they were there. They're everywhere. And the John Birch Society says very simply, all of this is wrong. It's unnecessary. Bring the troops home. Bring them all home tomorrow. And whenever I say that, there's always someone who said, oh, you're an isolationist. And I say, no, I'm a non-interventionist. I like to put it in those terms. I believe that people-to-people contacts are progress, and government-to-government contacts are usually treachery. Well, June 25th now, 1950, we're moving ahead. The forces of North Korea invade South Korea. And President Truman immediately sends troops to South Korea. Now, if he had sent them to get American citizens out of that battle zone, he would be acting totally within his powers. Because even though a president is not allowed to declare war, he is empowered, according to the founders, to respond to any sudden emergency. And so sending troops to take people out and get them out of the war zone and so forth, and then leave, is totally proper. But that's not what he did. He sent them there and told them to go to war. 2 days later, Senator James Kem, K-E-M, of Missouri, took the floor of the Senate. And he said the president had arrogated to himself the authority of declaring war, and he opposed it. Senator Leverett Saltonstall of Massachusetts, however, was very much in favor of what was going on. Other senators opposed were Malone of Nevada, Milliken of Colorado, and Robert Taft of Ohio. Taft stood up on July 28th, that's only 3 days into this affair, and he's told his colleagues that he might support a declaration of war if one were requested. But, referring to the Truman moves, he said, "There is no legal authority for what he has done. His action unquestionably has brought about a de facto war with the government of North Korea. He has brought about that war without consulting Congress and without congressional approval." And everybody knew it. With great foresight, Taft said this: "If the president can intervene in Korea without congressional approval, he can go to war in Malaya or Indonesia or Iran or South America." And couldn't he have added, "and Vietnam"? Right? Couldn't he have added, "and Vietnam"? He termed the way the troops were being sent into combat in Korea, and I quote, "a complete usurpation by the president of the authority to use the armed forces of this country. If the incident is permitted to go by without protest, at least from this body, we would have finally terminated for all time the right of Congress to declare war, which is granted to Congress alone by the Constitution of the United States." Absolutely correct. Taft went on and he said, he asked his fellow senators a question that none of them would answer. He said, if the United States was not prepared to use its troops and give military assistance to nationalist China against Chinese communists, why should it use troops to defend nationalist Korea against Korean communists? And the reason is that they didn't want to help Chiang Kai-shek because they didn't want him to be able to retain control of China. Taft earlier had given a speech at a place called Kenyon College, and he was talking about the attitude of the Truman administration and the policies of what was going on, and he said this whole policy is no accident. For years, we have been accepting at home the theory that the people are too dumb to understand that a benevolent executive must be given power to describe policy and to administer policy. Such policy in the world, as at home, can only lead to tyranny and anarchy. Yes. Well, in 1954, after the fighting was over in Korea, we lost 50,000 dead and I think 3 times that number wounded. The U.S. State Department of Defense release claimed that a Russian general named Vasilev had given the order in 1950 for the North Koreans to invade. Now, who was Vasilev? 6 months before the North Koreans invaded South Korea in June of 1950, Vasilev was at United Nations headquarters on the staff of the Soviet mission to the United Nations. He was replaced when he went to North Korea to build up the military and then eventually to give the order to march. He was replaced by another Soviet general named Ivan Skliarov. Everything the U.S. commanders were doing in Korea had to be sent to the United Nations. And how do you suppose that the North Koreans knew what our troops were about to do? Over and over and over again. In General Douglas MacArthur's marvelous book, Reminiscences, it's kind of like an autobiography, he quoted a Chinese general named Lin Piao. Now, let's remember that the North Koreans invaded the South, and MacArthur defeated them. And the war was won, for all intents and purposes, when the Chinese Communist forces invaded over across the Yalu River from Manchuria, and the war began in earnest again. And Lin Piao said this: I would never have made the attack and risked my men and military reputation if I had not been assured that Washington would restrain General MacArthur from taking the retaliatory measures against my lines of supply and communications. He knew that MacArthur was hamstrung, and this is the United Nations in action. This is the horrible situation of what we have done with our own military forces. Well, we move on then into Vietnam. Now, during the war in Vietnam, the John Birch Society was alive. Our organization was formed in December of 1958. And of course, the war in Vietnam really began to heat up in 62, 63, 64, and so on. And we began to realize that our own nation was supplying the wherewithal for the North Vietnamese to wage war against Americans in South Vietnam. Tremendous quantities of aid and trade and all kinds of equipment going from us to the Eastern European communist bloc nations, Poland and Czechoslovakia, even Russia itself. And that being transshipped to North Vietnam and being used against our troops. Why was this going on? Well, in 1961, a famous document, a document that we're trying to make famous, I should say, a document called A World Effectively Controlled by the United Nations, was written and classified, not allowed for publication at the time. It was done by a man at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, professor named Lincoln P. Bloomfield. Now, you know the thrust of this thing. The entire article, the entire thing was paid for by you and me, State Department publication. And it's how to design a world effectively controlled by the United Nations. That's what its purpose is. And in the course of this discussion, Mr. Bloomfield talked about keeping the Soviet Union powerful and why we were sending aid and trade and all kinds of equipment and so forth. And I'll just read one half of one sentence here and you get the thrust of it. He said, if the communist dynamic were greatly abated, the West might well lose whatever incentive it has for world government. The whole purpose of it was to scare us into saying, my golly, we've got to have a world government because the Soviet Union has missiles. And most Americans didn't stop and ask them, where did they get the missiles? They got the missiles from the United States. Well, we were supposed to be threatened to the degree that we would have given up our liberty and given up our national sovereignty and allowed the United Nations to take total control, but it didn't work. And it didn't really accomplish all of the goals that were set, so there is new techniques now. And I think that the sudden implosion of the communist empire in Europe, it didn't just happen, it was arranged. And I think the reason, I don't know, I think the reason was to make it more possible for the United Nations to take control, because during the years when there was all this grave contention between the United States and the Soviet Union, having the United Nations take control of everything wasn't that likely. And so now that there's this great attitude of friendship and so on, now the United Nations is growing in its power, and we certainly see that. The war in Vietnam was fought. Our poor troops, they went and they were told to fight but not to win. They were told to shoot but not till they were shot at. They were told not to chase the enemy across the borders. They couldn't go into his strategic hamlets. They fought with one and maybe even 1.5 arms behind their back. And finally, at the end, they were told, it's over, you've lost, and we're pulling you out. And it was also a war that was waged within the United States, a great amount of contention, tearing our nation apart for many long years. Very, very damaging in that respect. But again, 50,000 died, how many 100,000 wounded, and a completely disgraceful situation. Later on, Senator Barry Goldwater finally pried the rules of engagement out of the State Department, and he published them in the Congressional Record. And to read the rules that were set by Robert McNamara and Dean Rusk and other members of the Council on Foreign Relations, rules for how our troops could conduct themselves, it was one of the great betrayals of all time. Well, let's get back to the UN again, and what more do we see here now? We see that in February of 1992, a United States Army colonel, his name is Albert Zapanta, He returned to the United States after a 6-month tour of duty with a UN peacekeeping force in Western Sahara. That's way up in the northwest corner of the continent of Africa. One of 30 Americans sent there to monitor an election, Zapanta, came home and complained about being neglected by the United Nations, being threatened by neighboring Moroccans, and being forced to live in very dangerous circumstances. And his complaints reached a Senate Foreign Affairs subcommittee that called him to testify. But State Department officials barred his testimony because his appearance violated United Nations regulations, which forbid those who serve in United Nations missions to give information to national legislatures, even their own. Who's running the show here? The United States or the United Nations? The Bush administration did nothing to challenge this outrageous UN policy that amounted to another small but significant step away from national sovereignty. In May 1994, President Clinton awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor posthumously to 2 American soldiers killed during the bungled military mission in Somalia. The 2 American soldiers were dead. Their parents came to the ceremony. Mr. Herbert Shugart, the father of an Army sergeant who perished trying to rescue a downed helicopter pilot, refused to shake the president's hand when presented with his dead son's medal. He said to the president, "You are not fit to be president of the United States. The blame for my son's death rests with the White House and you. You are not fit to command." And you know that story appeared in only one American newspaper? And that one American newspaper got the story from a British newspaper. President Gore happened to be in Africa during the time of the tragedy when an American plane shot down some American helicopters patrolling in Iraq. This was the friendly fire tragedy. And so he commented about it while in Africa, and he extended, quote, "condolences to the families of those who died in the service of the United Nations." United Nations? Does the United Nations already control the U.S. military? Well, I don't think so totally, but I'm not sure. One of the tragedies of the Vietnam War was that we left so many men behind. I have a chapter in my new book about the POW situation. And I give details there that in February 1st of 1973, which was only a few days after the Paris Peace Accords had been signed by Kissinger and Le Duc Tho in Paris, Henry Kissinger hand-carried a letter from President Nixon to North Vietnam's Prime Minister. It contains specific details about our nation's plans to contribute to healing the wounds of war and to post-war reconstruction. But the very existence of the letter wasn't revealed to Congress or to the press until 5 years later, when some of our negotiators discovered it in Hanoi. The letter called for the United States to provide as much as $3.25 billion of grant aid over 5 years. And it called for us to provide other forms of aid in the range of $1 to $1.5 billion. It contained our government's pledge to create a U.S.-Vietnam Joint Economic Commission to develop economic, trade, and other relations between the two countries. Now, neither Kissinger nor the President could deliver the funds that they had told the North Vietnamese they would deliver without gaining congressional approval. But Congress had already considered any such funding the equivalent of reparations or tribute, the price only a guilty party would pay. And they would not go for it. They were in no mood to admit that our nation had incurred any guilt in the war. There was a citizen campaign started by the John Birch Society back during that period to protest against reparations We used the slogan, "Not one red cent." Now, what happened? Well, what happened very simply is that when Kissinger and Nixon found that they were not going to get the money, and they knew that North Vietnam had held back a lot of prisoners as ransom, as bargaining chips, in April of 1973, only a few months after, they declared all of the ones who hadn't come home dead. And they abandoned them. And I mean that. They abandoned them. There have been as many as 10,000 sightings of Americans in the war zone. Some of them first-hand sightings, maybe a third of them, maybe 2,500 of them. The whole situation of the POWs is a tremendous, tremendous betrayal of the men who went and the men who sought to win but weren't allowed to do so. What are we facing here, my friends? What we're facing is a conspiracy. We're not facing a conspiracy that's headquartered in Moscow. We're not facing a conspiracy that's even headquartered at the United Nations. We're facing a conspiracy that has a grip on our government and on our media and on our educational system. In 1956, J. Edgar Hoover, then the head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, wrote an article that appeared in the Elks magazine, and he said this. He said, "The individual is handicapped by coming face to face with a conspiracy so monstrous he cannot believe it exists." Isn't that the case with Americans today? Now, I'm not claiming that J. Edgar Hoover's view of this conspiracy is the same as my own, but he certainly believed that there was a conspiracy. And he said it was so vast and so monstrous that most people can't even begin to believe it exists. Well, happily in our country today, many, many tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people are beginning to realize that it does exist. And we can't present you with the leader of it. We can't tell you that they meet in this building. We can tell you all about subsidiary parts of it that we believe. We can pretty much lay a mountain of evidence on anyone about a conspiracy that is taking over our country and stealing away our liberties. It's circumstantial evidence, but it's overwhelming. And what we ask you to do is to take a look at it. Take a look at some of our books. One of the best is this one, The Shadows of Power, The History of the Council on Foreign Relations. I think that book demonstrates the conspiracy theory of history, which really isn't a theory, it's a fact, in my view. It does it probably as well as anybody. But let me give you one piece of evidence about this conspiracy, and then you can help to decide for yourself. One of my colleagues who preceded me at the podium here mentioned this State Department document, 7277. It's called Freedom from War, and it was published in 1961. It was published by the State Department. It was brought to the United Nations by President John Kennedy. It is the United States Program for General and Complete Disarmament in a Peaceful World. And he went and he spoke at the United Nations in September of 1961, presented this document as the fixed and determined policy of the government of the United States. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a three-step program supposed to take many years, and of course it is taking many years, leading to the United States disarming itself and turning over our military to the United Nations. Very simply. The Nuclear Test Ban Treaty is here, and that's been accomplished. The treaty to ban the use of outer space for nuclear weapons is in this document. That's happened. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, several other treaties that have been made with other nations are all part of this thing. You read through it and you say, well, yeah, that happened, and this happened, and that happened, and how close are we towards the end? Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're very close to the end. So let me read to you what it says at the end. It says, progressive controlled disarmament would proceed to a point where no state would have the military power to challenge the progressively strengthened UN peace force. It says states would retain only those forces, non-nuclear armaments, and establishments required for the purpose of maintaining internal order. It says the manufacture of armaments would be prohibited, except for those agreed types and quantities to be used by the United Nations. Is this program still in effect? Well, this is as it was published. It then became known as the Basic Provisions for Disarmament. They put a change on it, but they said in the new document that it was simply an updating and an expanding of the original, so we still use the original. But it was only about 18 months ago, I think, I called the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency in Washington, and I asked to speak to somebody who could tell me about the history of this document, and they put me in touch with a Dr. William Nary, and Dr. Nary confirmed to me that, yes, this program is still in effect and it is still being carried out. Now, if we turn over our military to the United Nations, they will then become subject to the military commander at the United Nations. At the founding, it was agreed that the Soviet Union would always get to appoint the person who holds this post. And so there have been 17 hold the post in the history of the United Nations, and they've all been communists. They just recently split the post. They now have an African who is in charge of that for Africa and South America, but a Russian ex-communist, now they call him, is in charge for our part of the world. Where are we? Let's realize something. The United Nations is not taking us over. What is happening is our own leaders are using the United Nations to take us over for them. The problem isn't in New York at the United Nations. The problem is in Washington, D.C., in our government. If the United States would not be doing what it is doing for the United Nations would be going nowhere. Practically everything that's happened in the 20th century has given impetus toward a world government. Do we want a world government? No. No, putting all power in any repository is suicidal. Don't do it. Independent nations are a good thing. Yes, some of them will be led by evil people. Some of them will do evil things. But the kind of people who are evil and arise in power in some nations are exactly the kind of people who will gravitate to head the world government. We don't want that. We don't want to scrap the Declaration of Independence. We don't want to give up the Constitution of the United States. What we want instead is for our leaders to stand by their oath to it. And so we must get out of the United Nations. If the United States support for the UN can be removed, the organization will fade away and die, as did its predecessor, the League of Nations. Other nations will follow the U.S. lead, as many have often done in the past. Without U.S. military might under its control, the UN will never possess its all-powerful UN peace force. If our nation terminates the steady transfer of our armed forces to UN control and removes our military from all entangling UN-related commitments, the world organization will be stymied. It will not be able to use U.S. forces to compel the peoples of the world to submit to its will, and it will not be able to employ foreign troops to do likewise to Americans. If enough people in this nation can be given the full truth about the United Nations and its many high-level promoters, certainly including our President, our Secretary of State, our cabinet officials, our media, a lot of our professors, foundations, and so forth. If enough people in this country can be given the full truth about the UN and these promoters, instead of the constant stream of pro-UN propaganda, the people of this nation will see to it that their representatives in Congress take action to get us out. George Washington once said that truth will ultimately prevail where there is pains taken to bring it to light. Pains must be taken by many more Americans if this nation is to remain free. Will you help? You folks who are before me, you folks who are hearing this on television, will you help? Daniel Webster has frequently been quoted as saying, there is nothing so powerful as truth, and often nothing so strange. It may seem strange, but it is true that the peace organization is a war organization, that its vaunted claim to be a fountain of justice is in this mean and vindictive world is a hoax, and that its protestations of protecting human rights and enhancing human freedoms are demonstrable lies. It is also true that the greatest promoters of the UN world domination and the most important enemies of U.S. sovereignty serve in leadership posts of this nation. The UN could not survive for long without the support of top officials of the United States of America. It is they who intend to have the UN that they will control rule the world. And they will countenance treason, lying, killing, and any foul means imaginable to accomplish their goal. We borrow the words of the Lord himself when we say to fellow Americans, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. What we have presented is truth. It must be disseminated widely and acted upon as if one's life depended on it, because it does. Very simply and very directly. If enough truth reaches enough Americans, they will choose new leaders who will withdraw this nation from the UN, rebuild our armed forces, and ensure that our military serves nothing but this nation. If enough good people decide to join the ever-growing army of patriotic Americans dedicated to exposing and routing this conspiracy in our midst, then America will remain a bastion of freedom for ourselves and for the children of today and tomorrow. And so we ask you again, will you help? Your help is needed and needed now. Will you give it? Our recommendation is simple. Contact the John Birch Society and get started in the vitally important work of saving this nation from a United Nations type of world. We are in a year when there will be many celebrations of the 50th anniversary of the United Nations, 1995. Ladies and gentlemen, please help us to see to it that there will never be a 60th. Thank you very much.
Mr. McManus will be up in a few seconds to take some questions, and we're going to do it Phil Donahue style with the boom. So please remain in your seats or remain in your area. We got a full house here. Again, I want to urge you to contact us at the end of the program. For those of you viewing this around the country, there'll be an address and hopefully a phone number, or you can contact the Boston office in Hyde Park. At this time, we're going to invite Mr. McManus back up, and please, if you have any questions, feel free to give them or ask them. Jack?
Sir.
Hi, I just want to ask you, what kind of pressure can be put on the military to go on a strike and refuse to cooperate with this business of a military cooperation? Just pass the word and just don't do it. Just tell them to go to hell.
All right.
What's wrong with that? I know the commander-in-chief is Clinton, but he should be assassinated anyway.
We don't recommend that. I delete that remark. Repudiation is what we look for. The men in the military are in a difficult spot. I think that the nation needs a military. I want good men in the military. I have spoken to military audiences, and I have gotten fairly good response, even with as tough a message as this. What we want to do is to treat the people in the military just as much as we treat our neighbors. We want to share information with them. They have a vote. They have influence. We want people in the military to understand. And so we would hope that the book that I've talked about here, that of course I've told you it's not available, but it soon will be, we hope that that will get into the hands of the military. And the military themselves are becoming aware of what is happening. Yeah, some of them are, yes. Right here in the front, Joe.
Yeah, Jack, what is the definition given as given in the document there? Do you think of enough of a military force to maintain internal order? What do you mean by that?
Well, I've analyzed that, and that's part of the book. What they're talking about there is the creation of a national police force. And that, of course, will also be under UN control. So you will maintain internal order with an internal police force under their control, and then you will maintain order in the world with the United Nations Peace Force that will impose the United Nations will. That's what they mean by it, because it's not a disarmament program as much as it is a weapons distribution program. See, they talk about disarmament, but they're not disarming themselves. They're disarming everybody else, and they want the United Nations to remain armed. So it's not a disarmament program, it's a distribution program. Yes, sir, right here.
How you doing, Jack? Can I stand up or?
Sure.
Thank you. Well, I like your material. I happen to have your book in my bag, Financial Terrorism. And here's a little food for thought, and this really touched me. The pastor's wife was telling me that this country is a bastion of freedom. For ever since we were beginning as a nation, we attracted immigrants from all around the world, fleeing from tyranny, fleeing from oppression and religious
It's still
bigotry.
happening.
You're right. And she basically said to me, sir, once this country goes, there will be no place for people to flee to because of our satellite technology. They can detect guns, they can detect bunkers, and she said to me, as a Christian, she says the only hope is salvation, to get saved.
Well, okay, fine. I'm glad to have your point, but let me make a point. I can remember about 25 years ago getting friendly with a refugee from Cuba who had fled from Castro and come to the United States. And he'd gotten involved in the John Birch Society, and he was very active and very effective. And I remember one day remarking to him about how lucky I was to be an American. And he shot right back at me and he said, "What do you mean you're lucky? I had someplace to go. I was lucky. Where are you going to go?" And it's a very good point. The United States is still a wonderful place. Much of what we believe in is still here. And of course, the Constitution still stands, which is why there is so many people talking today about let's have a constitutional convention to get rid of it. We certainly don't want that. So we can hold their feet to the fire. We can say to them, you've taken an oath to that. You either stand by the oath or we'll get somebody else. And that's the way we mean to change the situation here. We don't want force of arms ourselves. We have no intention of doing that. Sir, a question?
I'd like to ask you a question in reference to these base closings.
Yes.
Is this all part of the...
Disarmament, yes.
It's part of the disarmament plan?
Yes.
Also,
I was on a radio show recently, and a fellow called up, and he said, what do you think about these base closings? I said, well, they're closing the wrong bases. They ought to close the ones in Germany and Japan and Korea and so forth and bring the troops home. Ladies and gentlemen, let me wind this up with another little dramatic piece of evidence, I guess you could say. In May of this last year, May 1994, we got a letter from a young Marine stationed at the 29 Palms Marine Corps base in California. This is his letter. This is what he sent us, this material. And he gave us his name, and he said he's on active duty, and he had just been ordered to participate in a survey conducted by a Navy lieutenant commander among the troops on the base. And he was so furious after this survey that he came outside and he was talking to some of his fellow Marines about it, and he was just wild, and they were as well. And he said to him, he said, I wish I had a copy of that. I know where I could send it. And the guy said, well, they gave me two, and I brought one out here. So he sent it right to us. All right, it's a combat arms survey, and it asks the Marines to respond to all kinds of scenarios that are painted. Do you strongly agree? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you strongly disagree? Or do you not have any opinion? Check it off, and so forth. All right. So these are all attitudes. It's all about different roles for the service. And then it gets into the United States runs a field training exercise. UN combat troops should be allowed to serve in U.S. combat units during these exercises under U.S. command. Do you agree, disagree, or something? It's starting to get a little bit heavy at this point. The United Nations runs a field training exercise. U.S. combat troops should serve under UN command and control during these exercises. Do you agree, strongly disagree, and so forth? I feel that the President of the United States has the authority to pass his responsibilities as Commander-in-Chief to the UN Secretary-General. Do you agree, disagree, or what? I feel there is no conflict between my oath and serving as a UN soldier. I would swear to the following code. I am a United Nations fighting person. I serve in the forces which maintain world peace and every nation's way of life. I am prepared to give my life in their defense. You see, it's getting on and on. It's prepping young Marines for United Nations control. And then the last question, listen to this one. The U.S. government declares a ban on the possession, sale, transportation, and transfer of all non-sporting firearms. A 30-day amnesty period is permitted for these firearms to be turned over to local authorities. At the end of this period, a number of citizen groups refused to turn over their firearms. Consider the following statement. I would fire upon U.S. citizens who refuse or resist confiscation of firearms banned by the United States government. The United States Marines at 29 Palms Base in California were required to participate in that survey, and the young fellow who sent it to us, I've talked to him on the telephone, he said he didn't know of any one of them who wasn't really furious about it, which I'm certainly glad to hear. But the fact that they would allow it says something. Why would they allow that? Well, he sent us as well a copy of the base newspaper. In the 29 Palms base newspaper, there was an article about the Council on Foreign Relations visiting the base. The general was just delighted. He was showing the Council on Foreign Relations all around. He helicoptered them all over the base. And then, of course, if you look deeply into it, you see that the Commandant of the United States Marine Corps is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations as well, as is the head of the Air Force and the head of the Army. And in the past 15, 20 years, almost all members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff have been members of the Council on Foreign Relations. Our military is being undermined from within, and a lot of those men don't even realize how they themselves are being used. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got a big job ahead of us. We've got a wonderful country to save. I think it can be done. Education is our strategy, and truth is our only weapon. Please help us. Thank you very much.